This is Kathy with Barefoot Mountain School of Herbs, and today we're going to discuss wild cherry, how to find it, identify it, process it, and use it. Now, wild cherry, or wild black cherry as it's sometimes called, is plentiful in the Appalachian Mountains, and it grows as an understory tree in the woods. And it's often found on the edge of the woods, so a lot of times you just walk along the woods and you'll run into one. In herbalism, the inner bark of the tree is used, and the tree is the traditional wild cherry cough syrup that gives us the wild cherry flavor used to flavor cough syrups to this day. But the natural flavor is even better than the man-made flavorings used today. There's a very good reason wild cherry is used as the traditional cough syrup flavor. It's because wild cherry bark makes one of the best cough suppressants known to man. It's great for a nagging or persistent cough and the ones that keep you up at night, and it's mildly sedative too, so it's a good choice to take for a good night's sleep. It's also mildly expectorant, meaning it will thin or loosen the phlegm or mucus in your lungs so that you can cough it up easier. And the indigenous peoples used this herb as a nourishing heart tonic. Since it's in the rose family, it's also very good for heart health. But I believe where wild cherry really shines is in opening up sinus passages and relieving sinus pressure. Locating wild cherry in the woods is not very difficult. The adult trees grow very large, and they're the ones that have the potato chip bark that is very thick and rough. And since the adult trees grow very large, we want a young tree that still has the lenticels on its trunk. Number one, because with the big trees, it's hard to reach a limb. There's hardly any limbs that you can reach that are small enough to harvest. And number two, that bark is really hard to remove. So we're looking for these young trees. The lenticels also make the tree stand out in the forest. It's these horizontal lines on the tree. You look for those, and it makes it stand out. The trunk also has kind of a splotchy look. You can also look for that. Next, you'll want to look at the leaves, and the leaves have a shiny appearance, and they are arranged alternately on the stem. And in my experience, the leaves kind of look a little bit ratty. They always have these little rust spots on them, and they just don't hang neatly on the tree. So once you find one, you'll be able to look up and kind of pick out which one is a tree based on the leaves. If you look closely at the leaves, you'll see that they are elliptical in shape, and they are very finely serrated along the edges. If you turn the leaf over, you'll sometimes, especially later in the summer, you'll be able to see these rust-colored hairs along the base of the stem on the back side. And, earlier in the year, they don't usually have those, but later in the year, you'll find them. And that is a positive identification feature that distinguishes wild cherry from choke cherry, which is a look-alike, but it's not poisonous. It's just not as strong medicinally. So we want to make sure that we have an actual wild cherry tree. Another thing that you can do to determine if a tree is a wild cherry is to scrape a bit of the bark from the limb and sniff it and see if you can detect a faint almond scent from the inner bark. This is especially useful if you are harvesting later in the fall or in the winter when the leaves have already dropped. You can, you find one with lenticels, it looks a little splotchy. You can just just scrape off a little bit of the bark, and you can smell that little faint sweet scent coming from the bark. And, later on when you're familiar with the wild cherry scent, you'll be able to tell for sure that that is a wild cherry. Now, once you have identified wild cherry, there's two precautions you need to take before harvesting. Number one, you want to make absolutely sure that the limb you harvest is alive. Wild cherry bark, once it's fermented, becomes poisonous. It turns into cyanide. So you want to make sure that the bark is fresh, and you want to process it as soon as possible after harvesting so it doesn't have any time to ferment. You don't harvest wild cherry bark in the spring when the sap is running strong, because the sap contains a lot of the poisonous compounds as well. Any other time of the year should be fine. And I have seriously researched and looked for anybody that has ever been hurt from wild cherry bark harvested in the spring, and I can't find any incidents of that. But just to be on the side of caution, we don't ever harvest it in the spring. Okay, so when you find a wild cherry tree, there's no need to kill the tree when harvesting. You just take a 2 to 3 inch limb from a healthy tree, and then the tree usually recovers just fine. You take the limb home, and of course you process it immediately because of the, you don't want it to ferment. And today we're going to go over how to make my favorite preparation from the tree, and that is wild cherry syrup. But the inner bark can also be dried and saved for teas later, as long as it's dried quickly and completely to prevent fermentation, which usually means you put it into a dehydrator or a oven around 150 degrees and let it dry quickly. You can also make a tincture out of the bark. You place it in a jar and cover it with vodka. Shake the tincture every day for about 6 weeks, and then you press it out and strain it through a coffee filter, and that usually will last you about 5 to 7 years. If you want to do a professional tincture, you do it in a 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 ratio with a 50% pure grain alcohol. Now, when you're harvesting wild cherry and you want to process it, you remove and discard the thin outer bark. Now, in this video, it was done in the fall, so the bark is pretty tight. So you just peel it off kind of like you would peel a potato. But a lot of times of the year, it's loose, and all you have to do is you can peel it off with your fingers. I also take off that thin green layer underneath because it does affect the taste. You can leave the outer bark and the green thin layer if you want to. It's not going to hurt you. You can just leave it on there and peel it all off if you want to. But I take it off because of taste. Now next, you want to peel and scrape off the inner bark. You'll be able to tell, when you start scraping it off, what is the soft inner bark and what is the heartwood. The heartwood underneath is very hard, so you just peel off the soft part and you scrape off, and after you've taken it off, then it'll start to turn like an amber color, so that you'll be able to see, if there's still any inner bark left on the little limb that you're processing. Okay, and that's how it looks. You see the little amber, it's still got some of the inner bark on it. And then there is my harvest. Okay, now you want to loosely pack the inner bark into a glass mason jar, or sometimes I use a French press. It just makes it very easy the following day. So you just loosely pack it in there. You don't want to press it down too hard, but you want to have a good amount in there. Okay, and then you want to cover it with almost boiling spring water. You never want to expose wild cherry bark to boiling water, because at that temperature it destroys some of the constituents. So you just want to get your water to almost boiling, and then, place it in the jar. Then you want to leave the bark out on the counter until it cools to room temperature, and then place it in the refrigerator overnight to soak. Okay, then the next morning, you want to strain out the bark and lightly press all the liquid out. Okay, you want to be sure to measure your infusion and see how much you have, because you want to add that much sugar syrup to it. So this is almost 2 cups, and so I will want to add 2 cups of sugar syrup or raw honey to it to complete my syrup. So this is how I make my sugar syrup. You want to take, for every cup of sugar, you want to add a 1/4 cup of distilled or spring water to it. And you want to use good sugar, not, um, refined sugar. You want to use evaporated cane sugar, preferably organic. You bring it to a boil just to make sure it's all dissolved. Remove from heat and of course cool below the boiling point before you add it to your wild cherry infusion, because you don't want to destroy the constituents. Add your sugar syrup or raw honey to wild cherry in a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you have 2 cups of wild cherry infusion, you want to add 2 cups of sugar syrup or raw honey, and just stir it very well and then bottle it. Then you want to label your jar, of course. It will store in the refrigerator for up to 6 months. The adult dosage of wild cherry syrup is 1 to 2 teaspoons up to 4 times a day. I usually take a teaspoon at night for my sinuses. Traditionally, this herb has been given to children and even infants, and it's considered gentle. Of course, you have to do your own research and use your own judgment when using with children. Also, pregnant women have historically taken this herb safely. However, some modern studies have suggested that, there could be some birth defects from Prunus, and that is one of the main constituents of wild cherry because it's stored in the spinal column. So again, you want to be very careful and use your own judgment with this herb in pregnancy. And that is how you make wild cherry syrup. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you all, and God bless.